Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, Part 6. Soon we began to find out a little about our jailers. There was a Hauptmann in charge of the Fahnenjunker Company. The company was subdivided into 3 Züge. These in turn were led by either an Oberleutnant or a Lieutenant, with an Oberfeldwebel or Feldwebel as a deputy. The Hauptmann lived at home, but each of the Zugführer and their deputies lived on the same floor as their Zug. We saw them all during the working day, but after 5 in the evening or at weekends, they were seldom seen. The majority of these officers and NCOs had come from the 100,000-strong regular army, which had been retained within the terms of Versailles. The NCOs had almost all come from an army background and had initially trained policemen. Now, they had changed uniforms, but not their methods, to prepare us for our future service. They were obviously aware that, all being well, we would be their superior officers in 2 years, but just now we were under their control and beholden to them. The lower-ranking NCOs never missed a chance to remind us what power they had to scotch our careers by adverse reports. We all badly wanted our career and, in my case, above all, to fly. Thus it was that I was allotted the task of cleaning the shoes of my particular Korporalschaftsführer, the self-same individual who had made me run up and down the stairs until I took my tie off. The first day was filled with our reception and issue of equipment and uniform. Again, this was done in the noise and chaos which I had quickly become to view as a necessary component of my new military life. Items of clothing were literally thrown at you and pronounced as a perfect fit after the most cursory glance. That was the word of the day. It fits. Helmet fits. Boots fit. Jacket fits. Trousers fit. Everything heaped upon you with the constant barking of the NCOs. Fits, fits, fits. Then there was the regulation stitching of labels into each and every item of clothing and equipment. Hardly any of the boys had any skill at sewing, and their jobs seemed to take days. Always there were the Gefreite stalking around, picking up finished items, then throwing them into the face of unfortunate owners, ordering them to do it again. And again, and again, and again. They'd soon show us how an army should be run. My personal bogey was my water bottle. The stitching of the label onto the felt cover just seemed to defeat me. Every time I thought I'd got it right, the Korporalschaftsführer would rip it off and order me to do it again. I was up to the 20th time when we were given leave to go home for Christmas, and I smuggled the bottle out for my mother to stitch for me. At last, the NCO was satisfied. Giving us leave was a welcome rest for us, but it also gave me time to reflect upon what was going on. I was very depressed about my first 3 weeks. I almost wept as I told my parents that I didn't think I could take 6 months of this kind of barbaric treatment. Really, it was father who managed to lift my spirits by telling me that it was always the first few weeks that were the worst. After that, things would become easier. He asked me to have faith and stick with it. He had survived his rough introduction to the infantry and even managed to laugh about the antics of their NCOs, all those years ago. I felt a little better, but I still couldn't see that my present situation was anything to laugh about at all. I returned after the break with a feeling of dread. Despite my expectation to the contrary, things didn't seem to let up at all. In many ways, they were worse. It was January and the training grounds were wet with snow and slush. Every day we returned to the barracks with our trousers plastered in mud and wringing wet. Almost all the other things that we had to do, the overalls would have to be crisp, clean and white for the next day. Frequently, we would be found, after lights out, scrubbing and washing in the laundry room. This laundry room was really very well equipped for laundry work, with troughs for washing and scrubbing and an inexhaustible supply of hot water. However, it was strictly against the rules to be up that late, but it was the only way in which it could be done. Many of us would then go to bed with the wet overalls inside the straw mattress so that they would be dry and pressed in the morning. It was normal practice to put our uniform trousers under the mattress to sharpen up the creases. Every now and then, the NCOs would catch us out whilst doing our nocturnal laundry so that they could award the appropriate punishment and remind us that they were in charge. Punishment usually meant the withdrawing of one of our privileges, such as weekend passes out. Confined to barracks for the weekend, scrubbing floors and cleaning up. Another little game was Flagge Lucy. This had been imported from the Navy and was usually sprung on a whole room, which was 4 recruits, rather than being a punishment for one. The NCOs would order the 4 of us to the end of the corridor. Our room elder would report to them for instructions. They would then shout, for instance, "Dress uniform, 3 minutes." We would then run like madmen into the room and report back within the given time. The NCO would then inspect the room and woe betide the occupants of a room whose contents were not in perfect regulation order. What is hard to understand today is why we put up with it. On some occasions, people did rebel and nothing happened. I can remember one time when the NCOs went over the top and pulled everything out of our lockers, emptied the straw from our mattresses, and mixed it all up in a fantastic mess in the middle of the room. It was appalling. When the others came to clear it up, one of my roommates, who had come all the way from Peru to be in the Luftwaffe, suddenly took his bayonet and went after the Gefreiter. To our utter amazement, nothing happened. On another occasion, one of the other rooms decided that they had had enough. When they heard that there was to be another flagelluzzi to be pulled on their room, they rather indifferently appeared in the corridor and then went back to their room to finish some snacks they had been eating. The Gefreiter went berserk, shouting and screaming around the room, but nothing. The Feldwebel was called, and he did his share without result. In the end, they just went away, and the incident was forgotten. But, for the most part, the recruits played the game and danced to the tune that was called by the NCOs. We knew that although it seemed that all had been forgotten, the NCOs would get their revenge. And so it was. There were longer periods of holding rifles at arm's length or bunny hopping with the rifle held out in front with straight arms. Then, of course, there was always the NCO friend and ally, the mud. Every day that there was the smallest patch of mud or filth, they would see it and enjoy every minute as they had us down in the mud, up to attention, down in the mud, and so on. The officers couldn't be around all of the time. Although we were young and fit, it was still exhausting. One weekend, we were tired out and resolved to try to catch up on some sleep. It was no use just trying to stay in instead of taking a weekend pass. If you stayed in, there was always work to be done. It was no rest at all. So we took our passes and then locked ourselves in our room to sleep. At around 10 a.m. on Sunday, we were startled by one of the NCOs banging on the door. We tried to brazen it out by being quiet, but he wasn't to be fobbed off so easily. He returned with the master key and caught us. For the rest of the day, we were more gainfully employed scrubbing 2 floors with the brush, soap, and floor cloth. We felt utterly miserable, but we were determined to see it through. One lesson I learned very early on was never volunteer. One day we were lined up for roll call when the Oberfeldwebel asked, "Anyone who can play a musical instrument, 1 pace forward, march." Well, thinking in my naivety that they might really want musicians to start a band, like we had during Arbeitsdienst, I stepped forward. That won me potato peeling for the whole of the Sunday afternoon. During all of these months, we only went out a couple of times just to see something else. In the first few weeks before Christmas, we had to go out with a Gefreiter so that he could salute for us, as we hadn't been trained to undertake that particular complex task at the time. It was such a performance and a great deal of time involved in the training of the military salute. If we had to learn the Hitler salute as well, we might never have finished training. Eventually, we all qualified and could go out of barracks unaccompanied. Although we weren't very far from Berlin's center, just a short ride on the U-Bahn or the S-Bahn, I never ventured back into the city. I just didn't think it held anything for me and, frankly, we were just too tired. Closer to the barracks, in Potsdam, we had found a cheap little restaurant which was run by a very good-natured woman. The favorite for us was Bauernfrühstück, a mixture of fried potatoes, ham, eggs and corn. It had 2 other ingredients which were of paramount importance to us. It was cheap, 1 fixed price for all, and you could eat as much of it as you liked. It wasn't much of a social life, but it got us out of the barracks for a time, and that's what counted. Soon we began to start our weapons training, and here I found I liked the rifle best. We used the standard infantry rifle, the Mauser K98K. It was a bolt-action weapon which had no frills on it. At least I had done some competitive shooting with the HJ and the SR prior to beginning my military service, and I took some pride in recording a good score. With the machine guns, I wasn't so interested. There just didn't seem to be enough accuracy or technique involved. You just pointed the weapon towards the target, and on continuous fire, the magazine was empty in just under 3 seconds. I found it very difficult to hold the gun, as it bucked and reeled from recoil. We only had to reach a certain fixed score, and then we were judged qualified. The best feature of the shooting days for us was that it was a day out. A fairly long ride in the truck, followed by a day on the ranges. It was an almost normal day, something to which we would look forward. The other excursion which we enjoyed was to the infantry officer school at Potsdam, where, incidentally, Erwin Rommel was one of the principal tactics instructors. However, we were there only to swim. I was astounded how poorly some people swam, but then I had had the advantage of many summers in the river Tauber in Kreglingen. Again, in typical military style, they had set an arbitrary standard. We all had to be able to jump or dive from the 3-meter board. I did this simply for pleasure, but for some of the poorer swimmers, it seemed to pose an almost insurmountable barrier. Then the senior NCO would lay down the law. Either you jump or you're out. It was amazing to see how some of the more desperate souls entered the water. The more confident among us just sat at the side, trying to determine who, in fact, had made the most spectacular effort. In the end, we all qualified. By the end of May in 1937, we had the last exercise to do to complete our training. This involved a 90-kilometer march from the barracks to the training ground at Döberitz. This was not just a route march, but part of the exercise. We had to advance like a proper infantry unit, sending out forward patrols and securing the way as we went. We also carried our full complement of weapons, rifles, submachine guns and the heavy machine guns. Also, thousands of rounds of blank ammunition, for we were to be attacked many times on the route. Each man had his own full pack and complete equipment: rifle, hand grenades, entrenching spade, bayonet, steel helmet, gas mask and supplies. Altogether, it came to about 20 kilos and we marched about 30 kilometers a day. In the evening, we would come to a predetermined village where we would be accommodated for the night. About 2 kilometers outside the village, we would be met by a band and they would play us in with stirring military marches. After a hard day's marching and fighting, it really lifted the spirit to march in such style, and in the evening there would be a maneuverball in the village hall or the largest guest house. Typically, there would be about 300 people there and the band would play good dancing music. It was not to be missed. We were the heroes, and badly blistered feet counted for nothing in the face of such recognition, at least not until the next day. In the morning, we were roused early to be ready to march out at 8. Once more, the band would play us out, and on more than one occasion our first and last ranks were made up from local girls who had come to see us off. Many were the promises to return, few were the times that it actually happened. At last we arrived at the Truppenübungsplatz, where we were to spend the next 2 weeks. Finally, the diverse training and the many skills of warfare came together and it all began to make sense. Our finishing included the very dangerous practice of throwing live grenades and, for the first time, the use of heavy caliber pistols. All over the training ground we had our little wars. We sweated as we excavated dugouts, we labored to drag sufficient air to breathe through the stifling filters of our gas masks, we practiced the stealth of the sniper. We were quite good, but we all had in mind that we weren't going to be infantry. We were going to learn to fly, and the infantry training was just a hurdle to cross. A view not entirely shared by our regular army instructors. One event, which I will never forget, was when one of the staff sergeants took real exception to the apparent fact that we were being treated like regular infantry recruits. On one occasion, he waited for a time when there were no officers around, and then he ordered us out in full field kit: steel helmets, gas masks, rifles and fixed bayonets. Once out onto the training area, we were ordered to Achtungsmarsch, that is, to goose step, as if it were a parade ground. We hadn't had time to fit dry filters in our gas masks, so very soon the visors steamed up and we couldn't really see where we were going. We obediently marched straight into the trenches, piling in, one on top of the other. It was a miracle that nobody was badly hurt. That was enough for us. Even in the face of deliberate disobedience of orders and threats about the penalty of mutiny, we refused to do any more, and he had to march us back to barracks. This was not the end of the matter either. Some time after this event, we were back at Wildpark for a weekend exercise, when this same sergeant turned his platoon out for parade drills after midnight. At first, they thought he was drunk, and for that they might have covered up, but it became obvious that the problem was more serious than that. A few brave hearts informed one of the officers, and later, still in the dead of night, the sergeant was taken away to a mental hospital. We never saw him again. The last week was the breaking point for a few. The pressure was really on with long-distance runs, all-night exercises, nighttime orienteering marches, and very exacting marksmanship. I was to have mixed fortunes during this period. I was fortunate that I missed a lot of it, but considering the alternative, I'm not too sure I won the day. During the maneuvers I, like a lot of us, suffered blistered feet. A truck followed us on the longer marches, and anyone could elect to take a ride in the truck if their feet became bad. Mine had begun to blister, but typically I wouldn't give up. Doggedly I marched on with increasing pain in my feet until I felt the blisters burst and the raw flesh began to rub. Once more, my tenacity was to cause me problems. I finished the march, but when I took my boots off, my feet were in an appalling mess. I went to the sickbay at Wildpark and saw the medic. In typical military style, the medic decided that the loose flaps of skin should be cut away and then the feet liberally dosed with iodine. I warned him that I had a very dangerous allergy to iodine, but he dismissed this as my being babyish about the stinging of the iodine and applied the red solution with great relish. Within 30 minutes, my skin had begun to erupt in flaming red and white hives, and my temperature had begun to rocket up. I told him to check it, and there was a considerable consternation as the mercury passed 40 degrees Celsius. Then he called the doctor, who arrived in record time. The two of them really had their hands full for a while, and all the other casualties had to wait, whilst I was given complete attention. I was covered in a white powder to help stop the itching, and gradually, over the course of about 24 hours, I came back to normal. I gathered from snatches of conversation that neither the doctor nor the medical sergeant were going to report the problem. It wasn't the last time this allergy would cause problems for me. Even now, I'm still scared to go into hospital for fear of what might happen. Although I had missed the greater part of the last week, my grades had been good enough for me to pass along with the rest of the company. I suspect that the nature of my illness might have had something to do with this. If they had failed me, it would have necessitated them admitting why I had been in sickbay for 4 days. So, in the end, the infantry training was over, and during my last day of sickness, the whole Fahnenjunker company was moved from Wildpark across the bridge to Werder, on the other side of the Großer Zernsee. Werder, of course, was the military airport, which was now part of the Luftkriegsschule as a whole. At last, we were going to begin to learn to fly. It had been a long, hard road, but we all hoped it would be worth it in the end. Whilst I was still in the sickbay, the whole company packed up its equipment and moved from Wildpark to Werder. I arrived on the same day as the rest of my peers, but in an ambulance. Right away, the difference was clearly apparent. At Wildpark, we had been selected to form 3 platoons before we actually arrived. With typical German thoroughness, the platoons had been made up according to height. Our medical papers had been examined, and we had been grouped because of our physical height. Number 1 platoon had those who were 1.8 meters or more. Number 2 platoon, mine, had those who measured 1.72 up to 1.8 meters, and number 3 had those under 1.72 meters. It may seem to be an almost laughable selection, but on the parade ground, the nicely reducing height of the platoons finished off a smart parade to perfection. At Werder, there seemed to be a more relaxed atmosphere and no perceptible structure to the selection. There seemed to be a good mixture of the many German tribes, but then, with such a wide selection of candidates, this would have been unavoidable. There was nothing wrong with mixing us up in Arbeitsdienst. It seemed to help us all to realize how big the country was and how divided we, as a people, still were in many of our views and traditions. Our losses were also made up. We had lost some 10 men during the training who had, at one stage or another, failed to qualify. So, we had some new boys brought in who seemed to have had an easier time being given their basic training at other flying units. At Werder, the quarters were much more comfortable. There were only 3 or 4 of us to a room, and only 2 rooms using a bathroom. Quite the luxury. It was whilst sharing a room at Werder that I first met Hinnerk, who was to become a friend over many years and many adventures. He, like me, was now promoted to Fähnrich, as was our other roommate, Willy Hoffmann. Both Hinnerk and Willy came from northern Germany and spoke the Plattdeutsch dialect. I, of course, came from the south and spoke Swabian, totally different from the heavy accent of the north. Often, the 2 of them would lay in bed after lights out and exchange jokes in the incomprehensible dialect. Abruptly, one or both of them would break out into gales of laughter. I found it frustrating being able neither to sleep nor share their jokes. At times it was irritating, but it at least illustrates how the advances in communications have broken down the internal traditions and barriers of countries like mine. Sadly, I have to observe that other, more tangible barriers were erected in their place, particularly in Germany. Another episode done, another culinary delight to tell you about. This time we learned about the awesomeness that is Bauernfrühstück, which literally translates to farmer's breakfast. It's generally made from sliced or cubed potatoes and ham and fried together with some eggs. You garnish it with some pickles, and there you go, a hearty breakfast for the working man. It's supremely delicious. Also, we again learned about how the different cultures within Germany met for the first time. I've talked about this before, but will happily do so again. The dialects here are awesome. Some are really on the ears, others not so. And it's not like in America where someone from Boston can easily talk to a Texan. Someone who comes from a Swabian village, like Ulrich, is making noises that are completely incomprehensible to almost everyone else. Same goes for rural Bavaria. You all remember that one scene in the cellars in Inglourious Basterds, where the SS colonel can easily identify where each of the spies comes from? It's really that easy to discern. Anyway, Ulrich went through basic training this time, and I'm quite happy to say that some things changed and others did not. For one, hard training was still the norm during my time, but there was almost no screaming or hazing. I myself almost never raised my voice during normal routine while training conscripts, except for drills or formation or being out and about, of course. Why would you anyway? There are no more steps of escalation afterwards, and if they say no after you screamed in their face all day, you can't punch them, so what are you going to do? You heard it in his account. If the hazing went too far and the recruits just said no, the whole system immediately crumbled. It's why I find the stereotypical American drill instructor to be kind of hilarious. Now don't get me wrong, I get the basic idea behind this approach, but it is almost completely opposite of what the German army has been doing for quite some time. Anyway, next episode, Ulrich will take to the skies for the first time. I will hopefully see you then. Cheers, bye bye.